John 11, which we're calling the belief of Harry, Mary, and miserable Martha. So now John builds on that fantastic I am claim of chapter 10 even more, as if that were even necessary. With Jesus now claiming that ultimate I am the resurrection and the life. As if that I am the gate claim of last chapter wasn't nearly enough, huh? And he immediately backed up that enormous claim by actually raising Lazarus to life, according to our direct eyewitness, John. And Jesus actually wept here. For what reason, we do not know. It is suggested that he wept because he loved Lazarus a lot. He would miss the occasional company of Lazarus on his regular trips to Jerusalem. Yet that is merely taking things at face value, when the actual value may be a whole lot more complicated than that. After all, Jesus was definitely not desperate for his company, or he would have come a whole lot sooner. Besides, Jesus had plenty of company at the time. Perhaps Jesus wept as a result of the two sisters, Mary and Martha, weeping, if we properly follow the text. After all, weeping can be a highly contagious sort of thing, kind of like yawning. Yeah. Although their complicated weeping appears to be mixed with an extreme anger at Jesus for bringing far too little, far too late to the table, to their regular table of hospitality. If those sisters only knew what Jesus was about to bring to the table, right? And what he had already brought to the table, what a super lame criticism that would be then, right? Or, Jesus may have been weeping over the perfectly wasted death of his friend, even though some subsequent life might be generated through that soon-to-be-performed resurrection of his friend. A perfectly good death wasted, it seems, in order that some of those folks in Judea might also believe that Jesus was indeed the resurrection and the life. In order that those folks might believe that he was God. Yet it seems that this seems to be a bit of an overkill of a miracle for those awfully stubborn folks, when those previous words and deeds of Jesus should have been more than sufficient for those folks in order to prove who he truly was. So it seems Jesus was exceedingly angry about having to pull off those almighty words and deeds for Jerusalem at this belated point. To do marvelous deeds in the backyard of Jerusalem that had attempted to stone him twice already. So Jesus was super angry like a snorting horse, according to Carson. Or he was furiously angry like a gorgeous Queen Esther spurned, according to Barrett. Either way, he was pretty angry. Angry about having to say and display his might yet again. To say and display mighty words and deeds that he had pulled off in Jerusalem repeatedly. Like saying, I am words that they tried to stone him for. And now being requested to pull off an almighty deed like that earlier resurrection of a young man up north that we heard about in the service this morning. Or an earlier resurrection of a girl up north. Luke 8. Yet it appears that the sisters had not heard of those resurrections up north, even though our meticulous text of Luke 7:17 says that many of those down in Judea had gotten wind of what had happened up there, despite Jesus telling them not to spread the news, which we read in Luke 8. So, still, why did Lazarus have to be raised in the province of Judea then, if Jesus had already proved himself up north? Well, Jesus answered that question in verse 4. He explained it. He said, it is for God's glory. And that's an answer very much like the one Jesus gave in our frustrating great theodicy of chapter 9. And ironically, this raising to life in the backyard of Jerusalem, which was only about 2 kilometers away, was the very reason for putting Jesus to death. So that was not such a great public outing by this popular Harry Mary now, or by this miserable Martha now. Not so good. since we read that it was this raising of Lazarus that generated a bounty to be put on the head of Jesus. That raising was the last straw that broke the council's back, you might say. So then it seems that John was informed of this bounty that was put on his head by our darling Nikki of chapter 3 and chapter 7 fame. Or that John was quickly informed by a certain Joseph of Arimathea, who was also on that ruling council at that time. Information that was quickly relayed to Jesus, hence his immediate withdrawal from that bedroom community called Bethany. And this was a very generous bounty, about 4 months' wages, where we can read in our ESV. A generous bounty that Judas was very soon to pick up on soon after Mary anointed Jesus, anointed his feet with the abundant hair on her head. For it seems that Harry and Mary knew exactly what Jesus was about to bring to the table at that point. That's getting a little ahead of ourselves. Instead, let's take a look at something a little more uplifting for now. Let's look at the very common belief that we will rise again. A belief that Mary, or rather Martha, conceded to Jesus when she declared, "I know that he will rise again." Perhaps declaring it in the sense of, "I'm not that dumb, Jesus, not one of those unbelieving Sadducees, which would be quite consistent with her smart-mouthed, "Lord, don't you care that blah, blah, blah," she said before, and quite consistent with her stubborn buts of, "But he stinketh," of verse 49. And it is helpful to note that Mary and Martha did not exactly make the same criticisms of Jesus in our existing manuscripts, either, contrary to what you may read in your NIV. With Mary having the more questionable tone in saying, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died," as opposed to Martha's more accusatory tone of, "would not have died," would have not died, pardon me. A tone which doesn't seem to be lost on John for some odd reason. Yet, for some odd reason, it seems no sticky myrrh, which was resin, was involved with Lazarus here, just as there was no stink-eliminating spikenard involved with Lazarus either. After all, he stinketh. That's what Martha's comment. So, why stinkin' not, is the question. It's the puzzling question here. It's not as if those lovely ladies didn't have those embalming spices directly on hand now, is it? They knew Lazarus was terribly sick, that this was no mere cold, or they wouldn't have called for Jesus. And this was a relatively wealthy family that had them spices not long after that. Well, perhaps those ladies had, in fact, gotten the resurrection memo from up north after all. And perhaps they secretly held. Oh, wait a minute. We're skipping something here. Oh, we're skipping something here. Perhaps they secretly held to that resurrection belief after all. On Jesus returning to resurrect Lazarus after all, to resurrect him in the very here and now before he stunk. After all, they knew that Jesus was due for his regular Passover visit. It was that time of the year after all. So it seems that Mary and Martha were merely goading Jesus with those accusatory ifs. Still, they were appealing to Jesus to cause Lazarus to rise like bread, since Jesus was supposedly the bread of life, which he's mentioned repeatedly. And if that was the case, then doing that deathly dress-up with myrrh and nard would only be a good balm wasted. So those ladies were being properly frugal until next chapter, which we will see. So I kind of like the concept of their holding to that secret belief in Jesus, since it is quite in keeping with that needless and nardless embalming. And it sure beats an angry belief by Mary and Martha now, doesn't it? Even if they didn't share that secret belief with those other Bethany women at the time. They didn't share it with those other wailing women until a little bit later on, until they were instructed to take off the grave clothes of Lazarus, at which point those Judean folks embraced the belief of Martha and Mary and Martha when they then saw that Lazarus was not embalmed by his sisters. Not embalmed due to some extraordinary belief in an immediate resurrection, an extraordinary belief in the resurrection and the life, who is Jesus. Now, what I did skip was that ancient belief of rising again. We'll get a little history on that ancient belief of rising again then. This was very, very ancient. This came from very, very early on in human history. This is a belief which may be found in a book that Lord Tennyson and myself consider to be the finest literature ever written. A book that many rabbis consider to be written by Moses. Yet there's very good reason to believe that it was written by someone long before Moses lived. Written sometime around the time of Abraham, according to the highly renowned Gleason Archer. Now, this is a book that is properly considered as the great theodicy of Job. This is another frustrating theodicy if you read it through. A theodicy that appears to have escaped the shallow author of the Quran for some odd reason, the Islamic scriptures, with Muslims merely considering Job's extreme patience as being rather remarkable, and with Muslims considering their quirky Quran as being far greater literature for some odd reason. However, this was a resurrection belief very strongly held by Job, which we see in a faithful Job saying, "After my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God," which kind of gives you goosebumps, doesn't it? But of course, I wouldn't be least be surprised if Jesus spoon-fed that resurrection belief to Harry, Mary, and miserable Martha and his much-loved Lazarus earlier. He spoon-fed it in order to nourish that very sensible belief, that very just belief, and spoon-fed it in order to give even greater effect to that upcoming resurrection of Lazarus, since something even more public and stunning was clearly required for Judea, if only to multiply Jerusalem's unbelieving guilt. Okay, let's take a little look at these grave clothes of Lazarus, which you'll see a little bit on the illustration in the back then, because this is pertinent to Jesus' grave clothes somewhat as well. We'll get into that later on. So it seems rather important to John to indicate that Lazarus came out of the grave fully clothed, with a burial cloth wrapped around his head, so that he would have little idea where he was going, and with strips of linen wrapped around his hands and his feet, so that any going at all would be exceedingly difficult. So that was an even greater miracle from our miracle man, it seems. It almost seems like some sort of a levitation may have occurred. A miracle within a miracle, according to the 4th century theologian Basil. So, and that was done for various reasons you can read there. And so we will get more into those grave clothes of Jesus and how relevant they were to the grave clothes of Lazarus later on. And you may find that fascinating as well. Father, thank you again for showing us the belief of Martha and Mary, and may we emulate that belief so strongly as well. Amen.